They said blood was thicker than water, but money flows thicker than both. When my father died, I discovered just how thin family ties become when millions are at stake. My brother walked away with a construction empire worth $12 million. I walked away with $340,000 in debt and the bitter taste of betrayal. But here's what they didn't count on. I'm my father's daughter in ways they never understood, and sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what they give you. It's what you build when they bet against you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how I turned my father's debts into an empire that would make him proud. 4 years ago, I was the forgotten daughter, the one they said should focus on finding a nice husband instead of getting her hands dirty with blueprints and building codes. Today, I'm sitting in the same conference room where my brother tried to bury me under a mountain of debt, except now I own the building, the company, and every contract he thought was his by birthright. I was 29 when Dad died, a civils engineer with a degree from Colorado State and 7 years of experience designing residential foundations for other people's construction companies. While my older brother Jake spent his 20s learning the family business from the ground up, I was told that Mitchell Construction wasn't the place for a woman who should be thinking about starting her own family. Dad never said it directly, but the message was clear in every conversation, every family dinner, every company Christmas party where Jake stood at Dad's right hand while I served coffee to the crew chiefs. Denver in March can break your heart with its false promises of spring, and the day we buried Richard Mitchell was no exception. Snow dusted the peaks of the Front Range while we stood in Riverside Cemetery, watching them lower the man who had built Mitchell Construction from a single pickup truck and a toolbox into the largest residential contractor in Colorado. 43 years of 16-hour days, of betting everything on one more contract, of employing half our neighborhood and putting 3 generations of families through college. The company employed 230 people when Dad had his heart attack at 68, collapsing in the middle of a job site while inspecting the foundation pour for a luxury home in Cherry Hills Village. Jake had been groomed for this moment since he was 18. While I was studying structural engineering and soil mechanics, he was learning every aspect of the business, from reading blueprints to managing subcontractors, from bidding jobs to handling payroll. Dad made sure Jake understood that Mitchell Construction was more than a business. It was a legacy, a responsibility to every family that depended on the company for their livelihood. I watched from the sidelines, hoping that maybe, just maybe, my engineering degree would finally earn me a seat at the table where decisions were made about the company that had shaped my entire life. 3 days after we buried Dad, Jake called me into the conference room at Mitchell Construction headquarters on South Broadway. The building itself was nothing fancy, a converted warehouse with offices upstairs and equipment bays below, the same place where Dad used to let me play with his blueprints when I was 8 years old, teaching me how to read measurements and understand how a structure goes from dream to reality. The room smelled like coffee and sawdust, the walls covered with photos of completed projects spanning 4 decades, from modest ranch homes in the 70s to the million-dollar custom builds that had become the company's specialty. Jake sat behind Dad's old oak desk, the same desk where Dad used to spread out plans every Sunday morning, preparing for the week ahead. Our family lawyer, Harold Brennan, sat beside him with a manila folder and the kind of expression that meant bad news was coming. Harold had handled Dad's legal affairs for 20 years, and I'd known him since I was a kid. Seeing him avoid eye contact should have been my first warning that something was wrong. Jake cleared his throat and folded his hands on the desk, a gesture so reminiscent of Dad that it made my chest tighten. "Sarah, I know this is hard, and I know the timing isn't ideal, but we need to discuss Dad's will and the transition of the business." His voice was steady, professional, the tone he used with subcontractors and suppliers. According to the will that Dad signed 18 months ago, I'm inheriting Mitchell Construction in its entirety. The board, the contracts, the equipment, everything. I nodded, not surprised but still feeling the sting of finality. Dad had always made it clear that the business would go to Jake, even if he'd never explicitly said I wouldn't be part of it. I understand, I said, trying to keep my voice level. What about my role in the company? I was hoping we could work together. Maybe I could head up the engineering division or... Harold cleared his throat and opened the folder, pulling out a stack of papers. Miss Mitchell, your father's will does include provisions for you. You're inheriting what the document refers to as supplementary business assets. He slid the papers across the desk, and I saw my name at the top of a list that made my stomach drop. Equipment loans totaling $160,000 that Dad had personally guaranteed. Outstanding contractor bonds worth $90,000. Unpaid invoices and legal settlements adding up to another $90,000. $340,000 in business debts that suddenly had my name on them. Debts that Jake's inheritance was specifically protected from. I don't understand, I said, scanning the documents. Why would Dad saddle me with the company's debts while Jake gets the profitable parts? Jake leaned back in his chair, and for the first time since I'd entered the room, I saw something that looked like satisfaction cross his face. Look, Sarah, I know it seems unfair, but Dad was thinking about the company's future. These debts were personal guarantees he made to keep Mitchell Construction growing. Someone had to take responsibility for them, and since you're not involved in running the business, he shrugged as if the logic was obvious. Harold shuffled through more papers, his discomfort obvious. Your father left specific instructions about these obligations. He felt that. Well, he felt that taking on this responsibility would be character building. Character building. I stared at the numbers on the page, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. Jake got $12 million in assets, contracts, and ongoing revenue. I got enough debt to crush most people's financial futures, wrapped up in Dad's twisted idea of teaching me responsibility. Don't worry, sis, Jake said, his tone shifting to something that sounded almost sympathetic, but felt condescending. I'll make sure you get a Christmas card every year. Maybe we can have lunch sometimes. Talk about the old days. He stood up and walked around the desk, placing a hand on my shoulder that felt heavy and possessive. Dad wanted to make sure you learned what real responsibility looks like. Think of this as his final lesson. I gathered the papers with hands that wanted to shake but refused to give Jake the satisfaction. The lawyer still wouldn't meet my eyes, and I wondered how long he'd known about this arrangement, how many conversations I'd been excluded from while they planned my financial ruin. I'll need some time to review all of this, I said, my voice somehow staying steady despite the rage building in my chest. Of course, Jake replied. Take all the time you need. Harold can answer any questions about the payment schedules and interest rates. He walked me to the door, his hand still on my shoulder like he was comforting a child. Sarah, I want you to know that this doesn't change anything between us. You're still my sister, and I still care about you. Dad just had a different vision for how we'd each contribute to the family legacy. That night in my studio apartment in Capitol Hill, I spread Dad's debt paperwork across my kitchen table and tried to make sense of what had happened. The numbers were real enough. Equipment loans for excavators and trucks that were now Jake's to use. Bonds for projects that had already made the company millions. Legal settlements for disputes that had been resolved years ago but apparently never paid off. Every debt was legitimate, every signature Dad's, every guarantee legally binding. But something felt wrong about the whole arrangement. Dad had been meticulous about business records, the kind of man who kept receipts from 1985, and could tell you exactly what every project had cost down to the last nail. Yet as I dug through the boxes of financial documents, I found gaps that didn't make sense. Payments to a law firm I'd never heard of, marked consultation with no other details. Calendar entries in Dad's handwriting that said SM discussion, without any context about what those discussions entailed. The more I studied the will and the debt transfers, the stranger it became. Dad had restructured these obligations just 6 months before his death, moving them from corporate liability to personal guarantee, specifically naming me as the inheritor. Why would a man who'd spent 40 years building a company suddenly burden his daughter with its hidden costs while protecting his son from any financial risk? I opened my laptop and started researching the law firm that appeared in Dad's records. Brennan and Associates, Harold's firm, had handled the will and the debt transfers. But there was another firm, Chen and Partners in Boulder, that showed up in Psy. Dad's calendar repeatedly over the past 2 years. I'd never heard of them, never seen their name on any Mitchell construction documents. But Dad had been paying them consulting fees monthly for 24 months. If Jake thought he could bury me under Dad's mistakes while he sailed off into profitable sunsets, he was about to learn that I inherited more than just debt. I inherited Dad's work ethic, his attention to detail, and his stubborn refusal to give up when the foundation wasn't solid. But most importantly, I inherited his understanding that the best buildings start with the strongest foundations, and sometimes you have to dig deep to find bedrock. The next morning, I called in sick to my engineering job and drove to every bank and credit union that held Dad's loans. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with and whether there were any options for restructuring or consolidation. The conversations were depressing but educational. Dad's personal credit had been excellent, and he'd used that reputation to secure loans that Jake's company couldn't have qualified for on its own. In essence, Dad had leveraged his personal integrity to fund Mitchell Construction's growth, and now that integrity was my inheritance. But as I sat in the parking lot of the last bank, staring at payment schedules that would consume 60% of my engineering salary for the next 8 years, I had a realization that changed everything. Dad hadn't just taught Jake about running the business during all those years I was excluded. He'd also taught me, in quiet moments when we'd walk through job sites together, when he'd explain why certain materials lasted longer, or why foundation depth mattered more than speed of installation. Sarah, he'd told me when I was 15, standing in the frame of a house that would become home to a young family. The difference between a good builder and a great builder isn't what people can see when the house is finished. It's what's hidden in the foundation, in the framing, in the choices you make when nobody's watching. That's what determines whether a house lasts 20 years or 200. I'd thought he was talking about construction techniques, but sitting in that parking lot with $300,000 in debt and a brother who'd written me off as a financial casualty, I realized Dad had been teaching me about character. Jake had inherited the visible empire, but I'd inherited something more valuable: the understanding that real strength comes from what you build when the odds are stacked against you. That afternoon, I made 2 phone calls that would change everything. The first was to my supervisor at Morrison Engineering, explaining that I needed to take a leave of absence to handle family matters. The second was to Chen and Partners in Boulder, asking for an appointment to discuss my father's estate. When I mentioned Dad's name, the receptionist's voice changed immediately. "Mr. Chen has been expecting your call, Miss Mitchell. How soon can you come in?" The office of Chen and Partners occupied the 3rd floor of a restored Victorian building in downtown Boulder, with views of the Flatirons that reminded me why Dad had chosen Colorado as the place to build his dreams. Robert Chen was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with the kind of precise manner that comes from handling delicate legal situations. When I walked into his office, he stood immediately and extended his hand with a warmth that surprised me. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Miss Mitchell, please sit down. I've been hoping you'd contact me ever since I heard about your father's passing. My condolences. Richard was an exceptional man." He gestured to a comfortable chair across from his desk, which was notably free of the intimidating legal texts that dominated Harold Brennan's office. Instead, Chen's workspace featured architectural drawings and what looked like business development plans. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure why I'm here. I found your firm's name in my father's records, but I don't understand what kind of consulting you provided for him. I settled into the chair, studying his face for any hint of what was coming. Chen smiled and walked to a filing cabinet, withdrawing a thick folder marked with my father's name and dates spanning the past 3 years. Your father hired me to help him with succession planning, Miss Mitchell. Not the kind that traditional estate attorneys handle, but something more sophisticated. He was concerned about the future of Mitchell Construction and wanted to ensure that leadership would pass to the person best equipped to preserve his values and vision. My heart started beating faster as he opened the folder and pulled out documents I'd never seen before. I don't understand. Harold Brennan handled Dad's will. Jake inherited everything, and I got the debts. What kind of succession planning involves burying one child under financial obligations while the other gets a free ride? The kind, Chen said carefully, that's designed to test character and capability before transferring real power. Your father spent considerable time with me developing what we called a proving ground strategy. He wanted to see how both of his children would handle responsibility under pressure before making final decisions about the company's future. He slid a document across the desk that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a will, signed and notarized, dated just 6 weeks before Dad's death. My name appeared throughout the text in ways that contradicted everything Harold Brennan had told me and Jake. According to this document, Mitchell Construction would be split equally between Jake and me, with specific provisions for how we'd work together to lead the company into its next generation. This can't be right, I said, scanning the legal language that seemed to rewrite everything I thought I knew about Dad's intentions. If this is real, why didn't Harold present it? Why was I given those debts while Jake got everything? Chen leaned back in his chair, his expression growing more serious. Because your father specifically instructed me to hold this will for 3 years after his death, with instructions to evaluate how both of you handled your initial inheritance during that period. The debts you received weren't punishment, Miss Mitchell. They were a test. Your father wanted to see whether you'd crumble under financial pressure or find a way to turn liability into strength. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Dad had known exactly what he was doing when he structured that inheritance. He'd given Jake immediate success and me immediate hardship, not out of favoritism or disappointment, but as a deliberate experiment in character evaluation. So for 3 years, Jake gets to run the company while I struggle with debt. And then you evaluate our performance? Not exactly. Your father's instructions were more nuanced than that. He wanted to see whether Jake could maintain and grow the business he inherited, and whether you could build something meaningful despite the obstacles he placed in your path. The final inheritance would depend on who demonstrated the qualities he believed Mitchell Construction needed for long-term success: integrity, innovation, resilience, and genuine care for the people the company employed. I thought about the past 6 months, how I'd been grinding through debt payments while Jake posted photos on social media from expensive vacations and company retreats. How I'd been lying awake at night calculating payment schedules while he'd been expanding into commercial development without any personal financial risk. And if I fail this test, if I can't handle the debt and don't build anything meaningful, then the second will become irrelevant, and Jake's inheritance stands as originally planned. But your father believed you had the strength and vision to not just survive his test, but to excel in ways that would make the choice obvious. Chen pulled out another document, this one a detailed analysis of Mitchell Construction's financial performance over the past year. He also suspected that success without struggle might reveal aspects of Jake's character that weren't apparent when your father was alive to provide guidance and oversight. The financial analysis painted a troubling picture of Mitchell Construction under Jake's leadership. Revenue was up, but profit margins were declining due to increased overhead and what appeared to be poor project management. Customer satisfaction scores had dropped, and several long-term subcontractors had ended their relationships with the company, citing payment delays and unrealistic scheduling demands. Dad was tracking Jake's performance even after he died? I asked, studying the numbers that showed a company losing its reputation for quality in pursuit of short-term profits. Your father arranged for quarterly reviews through a third-party consulting firm. Jake doesn't know about the monitoring, but every aspect of Mitchell Construction's operations is being documented and evaluated. The contrast between his performance and whatever you accomplish during this same period will inform my recommendations about the final inheritance distribution. I set down the papers and looked out the window at the mountains, thinking about Dad's complexity and the layers of planning he'd invested in this situation. Mr. Chen, I need to ask you something directly. Did my father believe I could succeed with this test? Or was this his way of proving to himself that Jake was the right choice? Chen's expression softened, and for the first time since I'd entered his office, he looked less like a lawyer and more like someone who genuinely cared about my father. Miss Mitchell, your father spent hours in this office talking about your potential. He showed me every engineering project you'd completed, every innovative solution you'd proposed that the industry hadn't been ready to accept. He believed you, had vision and integrity that could transform Mitchell Construction, but he also knew that giving you the company without proving yourself would undermine your authority and create resentment that could destroy the business. So the debt really was meant to be character building, I said, remembering Jake's condescending words from the conference room. The debt was meant to force you to understand the weight of financial responsibility and to develop resourcefulness under pressure. But more importantly, it was meant to give you the motivation to build something of your own, something that would demonstrate your capabilities independent of the family name. Chen pulled out a final document, a business registration form. Your father predicted that you'd start your own construction company within a year of receiving your inheritance. He hoped you'd use your engineering background and understanding of his values to create something that could eventually merge with or compete with Mitchell Construction. I stared at the business registration form, which was blank except for a line where the company name would go. Dad had literally provided me with the paperwork to start my own business, anticipating that the debt and disappointment would drive me toward entrepreneurship rather than resignation. He thought I'd become his competition? He thought you'd become his successor, but only after proving that you could build something meaningful from nothing. The ideal outcome, from your father's perspective, would be 2 successful construction companies run by his children, with the possibility of eventual merger under leadership that had earned rather than inherited authority. The weight of Dad's strategy was overwhelming. He'd orchestrated a 3-year competition between Jake and me, with the winner determined not by politics or favoritism, but by actual performance under pressure. Jake had been given every advantage and asked to maintain what Dad had built. I'd been given every disadvantage and challenged to create something new that honored Dad's values while demonstrating my own capabilities. What happens if I don't want to play this game? I asked. What if I just pay off the debts and walk away from construction entirely? Then Jake keeps Mitchell Construction, and you keep your integrity, Chen replied simply. Your father made it clear that he wouldn't force you into an industry you didn't love. But he also believed that if you truly understood what Mitchell Construction represented, if you really shared his values and vision, you wouldn't be able to walk away from the opportunity to influence its future. I thought about the job sites I'd visited with Dad, the families who'd invited us to barbecues in backyards of homes we'd built, the crews who'd worked for Mitchell Construction for decades, because Dad treated them like extended family rather than disposable labor. The company wasn't just a business, it was a community, a way of approaching work that valued people as much as profits. If I do this, if I start my own company and try to prove myself worthy of Dad's real will, what guarantee do I have that you'll make an honest evaluation? How do I know this isn't just an elaborate way to justify giving Jake everything while making me think I had a chance? Chen opened his desk drawer and pulled out a sealed envelope with my name written in Dad's handwriting. Your father anticipated that question. He asked me to give you this if you decided to accept his challenge. Inside is a letter explaining his reasoning and his hopes for what you might accomplish. But more importantly, it contains specific benchmarks for success that remove my subjective judgment from the evaluation process. I took the envelope but didn't open it immediately. The weight of Dad's expectations and the complexity of his plan were almost paralyzing. He'd turned his death into a 3-year business school case study, with Jake and me as unwitting participants in a competition that would determine not just our financial futures, but the direction of everything he'd spent his life building. Can I ask you something, Mr. Chen? Do you think Dad's plan is fair? Creating this elaborate test instead of just making a straightforward decision about who should inherit the company? Chen considered the question carefully before answering. I think your father understood something about leadership that most people miss. Authority that's given is always fragile, because it depends on the continued goodwill of whoever granted it. Authority that's earned through demonstrated competence and character is much more durable because it's based on evidence rather than sentiment. But Jake doesn't know he's being tested. He thinks he's already won. Which means his performance over the next 2.5 years will reflect his true character rather than what he thinks people want to see. If he succeeds, if he grows the company while maintaining your father's values and taking care of the people who depend on Mitchell Construction, then perhaps he deserves to lead it into the future. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that had watched Dad build his life in Colorado. The peaks were constant, but everything else changed with seasons, weather, and time. Maybe Dad had understood that his company needed leadership capable of adapting and growing, rather than just maintaining what already existed. I need some time to think about this, I said, turning back to Chen. This changes everything I thought. I knew about Dad's intentions and my own future. Of course, but Miss Mitchell, I should mention that time isn't entirely on your side. The 3-year evaluation period started the day your father died. You've already used 6 months of that time paying off debts and trying to understand what happened. If you're going to build something meaningful enough to influence the final inheritance decision, you'll need to start soon. I tucked Dad's sealed letter into my purse alongside the business registration form and the financial analysis of Jake's performance. What happens if both Jake and I fail? If he runs Mitchell Construction into the ground and I never manage to build anything worthwhile? Chen's expression grew sad. Then your father's 43 years of work becomes a cautionary tale about the difficulty of transferring vision and values across generations. But he didn't believe that would happen. He had too much faith in both of his children, even if he structured that faith in unconventional ways. Driving back to Denver, I felt like I was seeing Colorado for the first time. The landscape that had seemed familiar and comforting now looked like a testing ground. A place where I'd either prove myself worthy of Dad's legacy or discover that I'd never really understood what that legacy meant. The debt that had felt like punishment 6 months ago now felt like a starting pistol. The signal that a race I hadn't known I was running had already begun. That evening in my apartment, I finally opened Dad's letter. His handwriting, precise and careful as always, filled 3 pages with explanations and encouragements that brought tears to my eyes. He wrote about watching me grow up in a male-dominated industry, about the frustration he'd seen in my face when my ideas were dismissed or my contributions minimized. He wrote about his hope that I'd use the obstacles he'd placed in my path as motivation to build something that proved my capabilities beyond any doubt. But the part that hit me hardest was near the end. Sarah, I know this seems unfair, and I know you'll be angry with me for putting you through this challenge. But I've watched successful family businesses fail because the next generation inherited authority without earning it. I've seen capable people overlooked because they never had the chance to prove themselves under pressure. I believe you have everything necessary to not just continue what I built, but to improve it in ways I never imagined. The debt I've given you is temporary. The strength you'll develop paying it off will last forever. The letter concluded with specific benchmarks Chen had mentioned. financial stability within 18 months, evidence of innovative thinking. In construction practices, demonstrated leadership capability, and most importantly, a track record of treating workers and clients with the respect that had been Mitchell Construction's foundation from the beginning. I set the letter down and picked up the blank business registration form, staring at the line where the company name would go. Dad had bet everything on his belief that I wouldn't just survive his test, but excel in ways that would make my worthiness undeniable. The question now was whether I had the courage to bet everything on myself. I spent that night sitting at my kitchen table with Dad's letter, the business registration form, and a calculator, trying to figure out if I had lost my mind or found my purpose. The math was brutal, but simple. With my engineering salary and careful budgeting, I could make the minimum payments on Dad's debts and have maybe $800 left each month for everything else. Starting a construction company would require equipment, insurance, bonding, and working capital that I didn't have and couldn't qualify for given my debt-to-income ratio. But as I read Dad's letter for the third time, something shifted in my thinking. He hadn't just given me debt. He'd given me motivation and a blueprint for success that Jake would never possess. While my brother was coasting on inherited momentum, I'd be building from the ground up, learning every aspect of the business through necessity rather than observation. The debt that felt like a chain around my ankle could become the foundation of my strength if I approached it strategically. The next morning, I called my supervisor at Morrison Engineering and requested a meeting. Janet Reeves had been my mentor for 3 years, and I trusted her judgment about both engineering challenges and career decisions. Her office overlooked the South Platte River, and the autumn light streaming through the windows made me think of all the job sites where I'd worked, all the foundations I'd designed for other people's dreams. "Sarah, you look like someone who's been wrestling with a big decision," Janet said, gesturing for me to sit down. "What's going on?" I explained the inheritance situation without mentioning Chen or the hidden will, focusing on the debt and my growing desire to start my own construction company. Janet listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with the kind of analytical expression she used when evaluating complex soil reports. "The financial risk is significant," she said finally. "But the timing might be better than you think. The residential market in Denver is shifting toward custom builds and renovations as people decide to improve existing properties rather than move. That's exactly the kind of work that suits small, specialized contractors." She pulled out a folder from her desk drawer and showed me data from recent projects Morrison Engineering had consulted on. "We've been getting requests for structural analysis on renovations that most of the big contractors won't touch because the profit margins are too thin for their overhead. But for a small operation with low fixed costs and high expertise, those projects could be very profitable." Janet's analysis aligned perfectly with what I'd observed about Mitchell Construction under Jake's leadership. He was chasing large, commercial developments and tract housing, the kind of projects that generated impressive revenue numbers but required massive crews and equipment investments. The custom residential work that had been Dad's specialty was being treated as an afterthought, something to fill gaps in the schedule rather than the core of the business. "There's something else," Janet continued, opening another folder. "Morrison has been considering expanding into construction management services for our engineering clients. We design foundations and structural systems, but we don't build them. If you started a construction company that specialized in the kinds of projects we design, we could potentially refer clients to you." The possibility of having Morrison Engineering as a referral source changed everything about the financial equation. Instead of competing for work against established contractors with deeper pockets, I'd be partnering with engineers who already had client relationships and understood the technical complexity of the projects I wanted to pursue. "What would I need to make this work?" I asked, feeling excitement building despite the obvious challenges. "Licensing, bonding, insurance, and at least 3 experienced people who can handle the actual construction while you manage projects and client relationships. You'd also need enough working capital to carry payroll and materials costs between billing cycles. Janet pulled out a calculator and started running numbers. Realistically, you'd need about $200,000 in startup capital to launch properly. The combination of engineering expertise, skilled craftsmanship, and genuine customer service was rare enough in the residential construction market that we quickly developed a reputation that allowed us to charge rates that reflected the true value of our work. But the real validation came when I received a call from Rebecca Morrison, the city's most prominent residential architect. Rebecca had built her reputation designing custom homes for Denver's elite, and she was known for working only with contractors who could execute her complex visions without compromising her design integrity. "Sarah, I've been hearing interesting things about Heritage Construction," Rebecca said during our initial meeting at her studio in the Highland neighborhood. "Patricia Williams showed me your work on her kitchen renovation, and I'm impressed with both the technical execution and the attention to detail." Rebecca's office was filled with architectural drawings and photographs of completed projects that represented millions of dollars in high-end residential construction. Her client base included tech entrepreneurs, professional athletes, and established Denver families who wanted homes that reflected both their success and their taste for sophisticated design. "I have a project that might interest you," Rebecca continued, unrolling blueprints for a custom home in Cherry Hills Village. "The clients are building a 6,000-square-foot contemporary home with some unusual structural requirements. They've interviewed 5 contractors, and none of them understood the engineering challenges well enough to provide realistic bids. The plans were breathtaking in their complexity and ambition. The home featured cantilevers, extensive glass walls, and an open floor plan that required innovative structural solutions to achieve the architect's vision. It was exactly the kind of project that separated true craftsmen from ordinary contractors, the kind of challenge that Dad would have approached with excitement rather than concern. "What's the timeline and budget range?" I asked, studying the details that would determine whether Heritage Construction was ready for a project of this scope. 18 months, $800,000 construction budget, and clients who understand that exceptional work requires exceptional expertise. Rebecca rolled up the plans and looked at me directly. "The question is whether your company is ready for a project that could establish your reputation permanently or destroy it completely." I thought about Dad's letter, about his belief that I had the vision and capability to not just continue what he'd built, but improve it in ways he never imagined. This project represented exactly the kind of opportunity he'd hoped I'd create for myself. The chance to prove that Heritage Construction could handle the most demanding residential construction challenges in Colorado. "We're ready," I said, feeling a confidence that surprised me. "When can we meet with the clients?" The clients were Thomas and Jennifer Chen, a tech executive and a surgeon who'd moved to Denver from San Francisco and wanted a home that reflected both Colorado's natural beauty and their sophisticated urban sensibilities. They'd been frustrated by contractors who either couldn't understand Rebecca's design or wanted to simplify it in ways that compromised the architectural vision. Our presentation to the Chens took place in Rebecca's office, with architectural drawings spread across a conference table, and Heritage Construction's portfolio of completed projects displayed on easels around the room. I walked them through our approach to the structural challenges, explaining how engineering principles could be applied to achieve their design goals without compromising safety or long-term stability. But the conversation that sealed the contract wasn't about technical capabilities or construction schedules. Thomas Chen asked about Heritage Construction's philosophy regarding client relationships and project management, and I found myself talking about Dad's belief that building someone's home was a profound responsibility that required respect for both the family's vision and the craftsman's expertise. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen," I said, "when you hire Heritage Construction, you're not just buying construction services. You're partnering with people who understand that your home represents your dreams, your security, and your family's future. We'll treat this project like we're building a home for our own family, because that's the standard we've established for ourselves." Jennifer Chen smiled and looked at her husband. "That's exactly what we wanted to hear," she said. "When can you start?" The Chen project became the defining challenge of Heritage Construction's first year. Every aspect of the build required precision, innovation, and coordination between multiple specialists. The cantilevers demanded custom steel fabrication. The glass walls required foundation work accurate to within quarter-inch tolerances. The open floor plan needed concealed structural supports that maintained the architectural vision while meeting seismic safety requirements. Tony, Maria, and Kevin rose to every challenge, bringing decades of combined experience to problems they'd never encountered before. We worked 12-hour days and weekend troubleshooting sessions, but the atmosphere was collaborative rather than stressful. Everyone understood that we were building more than a house. We were establishing Heritage Construction's reputation for handling the impossible with grace and precision. The project attracted attention from other architects, contractors, and potential clients who drove by the construction site to observe our progress. By month 8, Heritage Construction had received inquiries about 4 similar projects, each representing the kind of high-profile work that established companies rather than simply keeping them busy. But the real measure of success came when Rebecca Morrison called to discuss future projects. "Sarah, I've worked with dozens of contractors over the past 15 years, and I've never seen a team handle complex challenges with this level of professionalism and innovation. I want Heritage Construction to be my preferred contractor for all future custom residential projects." That conversation marked the moment when Heritage Construction transitioned from startup to established player in Denver's high-end residential construction market. We'd proven that a small company with the right expertise and values could compete successfully against larger firms with more resources and longer track records. More importantly, we'd demonstrated that Dad's approach to construction, prioritizing quality, respecting clients, and treating workers as partners rather than employees, wasn't just nostalgic idealism, but a viable business strategy that created sustainable competitive advantages. As I stood in the completed Chen home during the final walkthrough, surrounded by architectural beauty that Heritage Construction had helped bring to life, I realized that Dad's test was working exactly as he'd intended. The debt that had felt like punishment 18 months earlier had forced me to develop financial discipline, resourcefulness, and determination that I'd never needed as a salaried engineer. Building Heritage Construction from nothing had taught me lessons about leadership, risk management, and customer relationships that I couldn't have learned any other way. The company wasn't just generating revenue, it was creating value for clients, opportunities for skilled workers, and a reputation that would influence every future project we undertook. Jake's inheritance had given him immediate access to Mitchell, construction's established client base, experienced crews, and proven business systems. My inheritance had given me something more valuable: the motivation to build something exceptional from the ground up, and the knowledge that every success was earned rather than given. The question now was whether 18 months of progress would be enough to satisfy Dad's requirements for the final inheritance evaluation, and whether I even wanted to merge Heritage Construction with Mitchell Construction if that opportunity became available. I'd started this journey to prove myself worthy of Dad's legacy, but I was beginning to understand that the greatest legacy might be what I was building independently of his original company. 2.5 years into Dad's test, Heritage Construction had become everything I'd dreamed of, and more than I'd thought possible. $200,000. I had $340,000 in debt and maybe $20,000 in savings. The gap between what I needed and what I had felt insurmountable, but Dad's letter had mentioned something about using obstacles as motivation rather than excuses. If I couldn't qualify for traditional business loans, I'd have to find another way to finance the startup. That afternoon, I drove to every construction site in the Denver metro area where I'd worked on engineering projects, looking for crew members who might be interested in joining a new company. The conversations were educational in ways I hadn't expected. Experienced construction workers were frustrated with the direction the industry was heading, particularly the emphasis on speed over quality that characterized most large contractors. At a renovation site in Washington Park, I found Tony Ramirez, a framing contractor I'd worked with on 2 previous projects. Tony had been in construction for 25 years, starting as a laborer and working his way up to crew chief through skill and dedication rather than formal education. He was the kind of craftsman Dad had always valued, someone who took pride in work that would last long after he was gone. "Sarah, good to see you," Tony said, wiping sawdust from his hands. "I heard about your father. He was a good man, treated workers like people instead of equipment." "Thanks, Tony. That means a lot." I explained my situation and my plans for starting a construction company, watching his expression change from polite interest to genuine enthusiasm. "You know what the problem is with this industry now?" Tony asked, gesturing toward the house where his crew was working. "Everybody's in a hurry. Developers want houses built in half the time it takes to do the job right, and workers get blamed when corners get cut to meet impossible deadlines." He led me through the renovation, pointing out details that demonstrated the difference between craftsmanship and speed. "Your dad understood that reputation is built one project at a time. You can't fake quality, and you can't rush precision. If you're serious about starting a company that does things the right way, I'd be interested in talking." The conversation with Tony opened my eyes to something I'd been missing in my financial calculations. I'd been thinking about startup costs in terms of equipment and capital, but the real asset in construction was skilled labor. Workers like Tony had knowledge and relationships that couldn't be bought, only earned through years of consistent quality work. Over the next 2 weeks, I had similar conversations with Maria Santos, a project manager who'd been laid off when a large contractor downsized, and Kevin Wong, an electrician who was tired of working for companies that treated subcontractors as disposable. All 3 were interested in joining a startup that prioritized quality over quantity, but they needed assurance that the company would be financially stable and professionally managed. The breakthrough came when I met with David Kim, a small business banker who specialized in construction loans. David had worked with Dad on financing for Mitchell Construction's expansion in the early days, and he understood both the potential and the risks of the industry. "Sarah, I'll be honest with you," David said, reviewing my financial situation. "Your debt-to-income ratio makes traditional financing impossible, but there are alternative approaches if you're willing to be creative." He explained a financing structure that would allow me to start the company using equipment leasing, performance bonding through a specialty insurer, and working capital from a combination of personal guarantees and revenue-based lending. The terms were more expensive than traditional bank loans, but they were achievable given my engineering background and the experienced crew I was assembling. "The key is demonstrating cash flow from day one," David explained. "If you can show consistent project revenue and maintain tight cost controls, you can refinance into better terms within 18 months. The financing plan required me to personally guarantee everything, which meant that failure wouldn't just cost me the business, but could also force me into bankruptcy. But success would prove my capabilities in ways that inheriting a company never could." I was betting everything on my belief that Dad had been right about my potential, even if his methods for developing that potential had been unconventional. I named the company Heritage Construction, a name that honored Dad's legacy, while establishing my own identity. The business registration form that had sat blank on my desk for weeks now contained a company name that represented everything I hoped to build: a construction firm that valued craftsmanship, integrity, and the kind of long-term thinking that creates lasting value rather than quick profits. The first 3 months of Heritage Construction were a masterclass in entrepreneurial struggle and determination. We operated out of a rented warehouse space in Commerce City, with used equipment purchased at auction and an office that consisted of folding tables and borrowed computers. Tony, Maria, and Kevin had taken salary cuts to join the startup, betting their own financial security on my vision for what the company could become. Our first project was a kitchen renovation in Cherry Creek for a client referred by Janet at Morrison Engineering. The homeowners, Dr. Patricia Williams and her husband Mark, were both physicians who wanted a space that reflected their professional success while maintaining the character of their 1920s Tudor home. The structural requirements were complex, involving load-bearing wall modifications and foundation reinforcement that most contractors either couldn't handle or didn't want to attempt. I spent hours with the Williams family, understanding not just their functional requirements, but their vision for how the space would enhance their daily lives. The engineering challenges were significant, but they were exactly the kind of problems I'd been trained to solve. Instead of treating the structural modifications as obstacles to be minimized, I approached them as opportunities to improve the overall integrity and functionality of the home. The project took 6 weeks longer than a typical contractor would have scheduled, but the results exceeded every expectation. We didn't just renovate their kitchen, we transformed it into a space that felt both historically appropriate and completely modern. The Williams family was so impressed that they asked us to handle additional renovations throughout the house, extending what had been a single-room project into a comprehensive update that generated 6 months of steady work. More importantly, Dr. Williams began referring Heritage Construction to her colleagues and friends, creating a network of high-end residential clients who valued quality over speed. These weren't customers looking for the lowest bid. They were professionals who understood that exceptional work justified premium pricing and who appreciated working with contractors who treated their homes with respect. Word of mouth in Denver's professional community was powerful and fast-moving. Within 4 months, Heritage Construction had a waiting list of projects that extended 6 months into the future. We employed 18 full-time craftsmen, had partnerships with 6 architectural firms, and maintained a project backlog that extended 8 months into the future. Our reputation for handling complex residential construction had spread beyond Denver to Aspen, Vail, and Boulder, where wealthy clients were willing to pay premium rates for the kind of craftsmanship that had become Heritage Construction's signature. But success brought visibility, and visibility brought attention from competitors who'd initially dismissed us as a boutique operation with limited growth potential. Among those competitors was Mitchell Construction, which had been struggling, under Jake's leadership in ways that became more apparent as my own company flourished. The construction industry in Colorado was smaller than most people realized, and word traveled fast about companies that were thriving or failing. Through conversations with suppliers, subcontractors, and architects, I'd learned that Mitchell Construction was facing challenges that went beyond normal market fluctuations. Several major projects had experienced cost overruns and completion, delays that strained relationships with clients and created cash flow problems that Jake was managing through increasingly creative financing arrangements. More troubling were reports about workplace culture and employee retention. 3 of Dad's most experienced crew chiefs had left Mitchell Construction within the past year, citing concerns about safety shortcuts and unrealistic scheduling demands. The company that had once been known for treating workers with respect and dignity was now developing a reputation for high turnover and low morale. Janet Reeves at Morrison Engineering had shared information that painted an even darker picture of Mitchell Construction's trajectory. "Sarah, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but we've had to terminate our consulting relationship with your brother's company. They've been pressuring our engineers to approve structural modifications that don't meet safety standards, and we can't risk our professional licenses for the sake of their profit margins." The irony wasn't lost on me that Heritage Construction was succeeding by following the principles that Mitchell Construction was abandoning. While Jake pursued larger contracts and higher revenues, he was sacrificing the reputation for quality and integrity that Dad had spent 40 years building. The short-term profits from cutting corners were undermining the long-term value of the company's brand and relationships. But my focus remained on building heritage construction rather than monitoring Jake's failures. We'd recently signed contracts for 2 major projects that would establish us as the premier custom residential contractor in Colorado. The first was a mountain retreat in Aspen for a tech billionaire who wanted a home that appeared to emerge naturally from the landscape while incorporating the most advanced sustainable building technologies available. The second project was even more significant: a historic renovation and expansion of the Governor's Mansion carriage house, a project that combined preservation challenges with modern functionality requirements. The state had selected heritage construction from a field of 12 qualified contractors, largely based on our demonstrated ability to respect architectural integrity while achieving contemporary performance standards. These projects represented more than business success. They were proof that the company I'd built from nothing could compete successfully against established firms with decades of experience and significantly larger resources. Heritage construction had earned respect through performance rather than inherited reputation, and that distinction mattered more to me than any financial milestone we might achieve. The call from Robert Chen came on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 3 years after Dad's death. I was reviewing structural drawings for the Aspen project when my assistant informed me that Dad's estate attorney needed to schedule a meeting to discuss the final evaluation of the inheritance provisions. "Miss Mitchell, I hope you have time to meet this week," Chen said when I returned his call. "The 3-year evaluation period concluded last month, and I've completed my analysis of both your performance and your brother's performance during this testing phase." My heart started racing despite my efforts to remain calm. 3 years of building heritage construction, of proving myself capable of creating something meaningful from nothing, had led to this moment. "What did you conclude, Mr. Chen?" "I'd prefer to discuss my findings in person, with both you and your brother present. Are you available Friday afternoon for a meeting at my office? I've already contacted Jake and he's agreed to attend, though he's not entirely sure why the meeting is necessary." The prospect of sitting in the same room with Jake for the first time since Dad's funeral was both anticipated and dreaded. We'd avoided each other for 3 years, moving in different professional circles despite working in the same industry. I'd heard about his struggles through industry gossip, but we'd never spoken directly about what had happened since our father's death. "I'll be there," I said. "Should I bring anything specific? Financial records? Business documentation? I have everything I need for the evaluation. Just bring yourself and an open mind about what your father was trying to accomplish with this arrangement." Friday afternoon, I drove to Boulder with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that reminded me of final exam days in engineering. School. The stakes felt enormous, not just for the financial implications but for what the evaluation would reveal about Dad's true assessment of my capabilities and Jake's performance. Robert Chen's office looked exactly the same as it had 3 years earlier, but I felt completely different walking into it. The woman who'd first entered this room had been confused, hurt, and uncertain about her future. The woman entering today was the CEO of a successful construction company, confident in her abilities and clear about her values. Jake was already seated when I arrived, and the 3 years had changed him in ways that were immediately apparent. He looked older, more stressed, with the kind of fatigue that comes from chronic worry about problems that have no easy solutions. His greeting was polite but distant, and I could see him evaluating my appearance and demeanor for clues about what the meeting would reveal. "Thank you both for coming," Chen said, settling behind his desk with a thick folder that I recognized as the evaluation file he'd been building throughout the testing period. "Before we discuss my findings, I want to review what your father was trying to accomplish with the inheritance structure he created." Chen opened the folder and pulled out financial statements, performance reports, and what appeared to be detailed analyses of both Mitchell Construction and Heritage Construction. Richard wanted to ensure that his legacy would be preserved and, enhanced by whoever inherited control of his life's work. He believed that leadership should be earned through demonstrated competence rather than granted through accident of birth order. He turned to Jake first. "Mr. Mitchell, your father left you Mitchell Construction with the expectation that you would maintain its reputation for quality while growing the business in ways that honored his values. Let me share what the evaluation revealed about your performance." The financial data was damning in ways that surprised even me. Mitchell Construction's revenues had grown by 30% during the 3-year period, but profit margins had declined by 40% due to increased costs from project delays, rework, and legal settlements. Customer satisfaction scores had dropped from 92% to 68%, and employee turnover had increased by 200%. More concerning than the financial performance, Chen continued, are the reports about workplace safety and professional conduct. Mitchell Construction has received 14 citations from state labor regulators, compared to 0 citations during your father's final 3 years of leadership. The company has also been terminated as a contractor by 3 major clients due to quality concerns. Jake's face had grown progressively paler as Chen presented the evaluation data. "Those problems weren't entirely my fault," he said defensively. "The market became more competitive, labor costs increased, and clients became more demanding about schedules and pricing." "All true," Chen agreed. "But other contractors faced the same market conditions without experiencing the same decline in performance and reputation. The question your father wanted answered was whether you could maintain his standards while adapting to changing circumstances." Chen turned to me and pulled out a second set of documents. "Miss Mitchell, your father gave you significant debt and no business assets, with the expectation that you would either develop the resourcefulness to overcome those obstacles or demonstrate that you weren't suited for leadership responsibility." The Heritage Construction evaluation was comprehensive in ways I hadn't expected. Chen had tracked not just our financial performance, but our client relationships, employee satisfaction, safety record, and community impact. The data showed a company that had grown from nothing to 18 employees and $2 million in annual revenue while maintaining customer satisfaction scores above 95% and 0 safety violations. What impressed me most about Heritage Construction, Chen said, wasn't just the financial success but the approach to business that mirrors your father's values. You've built a company that prioritizes long-term relationships over short-term profits, that treats employees as partners rather than expenses, and that views quality craftsmanship as a competitive advantage rather than a cost burden. Jake had been listening to the evaluation with growing agitation, and he finally interrupted Chen's presentation. "I don't understand what this has to do with Dad's estate. I inherited Mitchell Construction 3 years ago. Whatever Sarah has built with her company doesn't change that legal reality." Chen smiled and pulled out the document I'd been waiting 3 years to see again. "Actually, Mr. Mitchell, the will that gave you Mitchell Construction was conditional on your performance during a 3-year evaluation period. The document I filed with the county was your father's backup plan, designed to transfer ownership if you proved incapable of maintaining his standards." He slid the real will across the desk, the same document I'd seen 3 years earlier but had never fully processed in terms of its implications. According to the legal language that Chen began reading aloud, Mitchell Construction would be divided equally between Jake and me if both of us demonstrated competence during the evaluation period. If only one of us met Dad's standards, that person would inherit full control. If neither of us succeeded, the company would be sold and the proceeds donated to a scholarship fund for construction trade education. Based on my evaluation, Chen D. concluded, Jake failed to meet the performance standards your father established, while Sarah exceeded them in every measurable category. According to the terms of the real will, Sarah Mitchell inherits full ownership and control of Mitchell Construction, effective immediately. The silence in the room was deafening. Jake stared at the will documents as if they were written in a foreign language, while I tried to process the magnitude of what Chen had just announced. I'd spent 3 years building Heritage Construction to prove myself worthy of inheriting Dad's company, but I'd never fully believed that moment would actually arrive. "This can't be legal," Jake said finally. "You can't just replace one will with another after 3 years. I've been running Mitchell Construction based on the assumption that I owned it." "The conditional nature of your inheritance was clearly stated in the original documents," Chen replied calmly. "You've been managing the company as a conditional owner, subject to performance requirements that were explained to you at the time. The 3-year evaluation determined whether that conditional ownership would become permanent." Chen pulled out additional documents that formalized the transfer of ownership and outlined the legal procedures for changing corporate control. "Miss Mitchell, you now own Mitchell Construction outright, with the authority to make any changes you deem necessary for the company's future success." I looked at Jake, seeing 3 years of stress and failure written across his face, and felt something I hadn't expected: sympathy rather than satisfaction. He'd inherited a successful company and driven it toward mediocrity through decisions that prioritized short-term gains over long-term sustainability. But he was still my brother, and destroying him completely wouldn't honor Dad's memory or values. "Jake," I said carefully, "I don't want to humiliate you or destroy what you've built, but I also can't ignore what's happened to Mitchell Construction over the past 3 years. The company Dad spent his life building deserves better than what it's become." I turned to Chen and asked about options for restructuring the transition in ways that might preserve Jake's dignity while addressing the company's problems. "What flexibility do I have in terms of how we handle this ownership change?" Chen had anticipated that question and pulled out a folder containing several alternative approaches Dad had authorized. "Your father hoped you might choose a collaborative solution if you proved yourself worthy of inheritance. He suggested the possibility of maintaining Jake's involvement in the company while placing you in ultimate authority over strategic decisions and operational standards. The proposal Chen outlined would make me CEO and majority owner of Mitchell Construction, while offering Jake a reduced ownership stake and a defined role focused on business development rather than operational management. It was a structure that acknowledged his experience with the company's client relationships, while removing his authority over the decisions that had damaged Mitchell Construction's reputation. "I'd also like to propose something Dad didn't anticipate," I said, looking directly at Jake. "Heritage Construction has built something valuable over the past 3 years. Instead of simply absorbing Mitchell Construction or vice versa, what if we merged both companies into something stronger than either could be independently?" The merger concept I outlined would combine Heritage Construction's reputation for quality with Mitchell Construction's established client base and larger workforce. Jake would retain ownership stake and operational involvement, but under my leadership and with a renewed commitment to the values that had made Dad's company successful originally. "Why would you offer me anything?" Jake asked, his voice reflecting genuine confusion about my motivations. "You've earned the right to take everything. Why not just claim victory and move on?" I thought about Dad's letter, about his hope that both of his children would succeed, and potentially work together to build something greater than what he'd accomplished individually. Because family legacy isn't about winners and losers, Jake. It's about preserving what matters and improving what's possible. Mitchell Construction became successful because Dad understood that treating people with respect and dignity creates sustainable competitive advantages. If we're going to work together, we need to agree on fundamental principles about how the company operates. Quality over speed, long-term relationships over short-term profits, employee respect over cost-cutting, shortcuts. Can you commit to those standards? Jake studied my face for a long moment, perhaps seeing something he'd missed during our years of separation. "Sarah, I need to ask you something honestly. Do you think I'm capable of learning from my mistakes and contributing meaningfully to whatever we build together?" His question revealed a vulnerability and self-awareness that I hadn't expected. The past 3 years had taught him lessons about leadership and responsibility that success alone never could have provided. Perhaps Dad's test had worked for both of us, giving me the confidence to lead and giving Jake the humility to follow when necessary. "I think you're capable of being the person Dad hoped you'd become," I replied. "But it's going to require changes in how you approach business relationships and operational decisions. Are you willing to accept that I'll have final authority over those areas?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I've seen what Heritage Construction accomplished, and I've lived with the consequences of my mistakes at Mitchell Construction. I'm willing to learn from someone who's proven herself capable of building something exceptional." Chen documented our agreement in legal language that formalized my ownership of Mitchell Construction while creating a partnership structure that preserved Jake's involvement and dignity. The merged company would operate under the Mitchell, the construction name, but with Heritage Construction's standards and operational philosophy. More importantly, the agreement included provisions for profit sharing with employees, safety incentives, and quality bonuses that would align everyone's interests with long-term success rather than short-term cost-cutting. The company Dad had built would continue, but stronger and more sustainable than it had ever been under single-family leadership. As we signed the final documents that afternoon, I realized that Dad's test had accomplished something more sophisticated than simply determining which child was more qualified to inherit his company. He'd created a situation that forced both of us to discover our true capabilities and limitations, leading to a partnership that neither of us could have achieved independently. Walking out of Chen's office, I felt the weight of responsibility that comes with inheriting something precious and fragile. Mitchell Construction now employed over 200 people whose families depended on the company's success. The decisions I made would influence not just my own future, but the livelihoods of everyone who'd chosen to build their careers around Dad's vision. But I also felt the confidence that comes from having earned authority through demonstrated competence, rather than inherited privilege. Heritage Construction had proven that Dad's values weren't just nostalgic idealism, but practical business principles that created sustainable competitive advantages. Now, I had the opportunity to apply those principles on a larger scale while honoring the legacy of everything he'd built. The drive back to Denver took me past construction sites where both Heritage Construction and Mitchell Construction crews were working, building homes and commercial projects that would outlast all of us. Dad had understood something profound about construction that extends beyond buildings to character, relationships, and legacy. The strongest foundations are built from principles that can support whatever weight the future places on them. Jake called me that evening to discuss transition plans and operational changes that would align Mitchell Construction with the standards Heritage Construction had established. Our conversation was professional, but warmer than any we'd shared, since Dad's death, focused on practical solutions rather than past grievances. "Sarah," he said near the end of our call, "I want you to know that I understand why Dad structured his will the way he did. I needed to learn lessons that success alone couldn't teach, and you needed the opportunity to prove yourself independent of family connections. It was painful, but it was also wise." "He believed in both of us," I replied. "He just understood that we needed different challenges to bring out our best qualities." 3 months later, the merged Mitchell Construction was operating with an efficiency and purpose that exceeded what either company had achieved independently. We'd completed the Aspen Retreat project to international acclaim, secured contracts for 4 additional high-profile developments, and established a company culture that attracted the best craftsmen and engineers in Colorado. But the measure of success that would have meant the most to Dad wasn't financial or professional recognition. It was the fact that Jake and I had learned to work together as partners, combining our different strengths in service of something larger than either of our individual ambitions. The company he'd built had become a family business in the truest sense, operated by people who understood that legacy isn't just what you inherit, but what you choose to build with what you've been given. Standing in the conference room where Jake had first told me about my inheritance of debt, Looking out at the Denver skyline that included buildings we'd both helped create, I understood that Dad's final gift hadn't been the company itself, but the opportunity to discover who I could become when challenged to exceed my own expectations. The debt that had seemed like punishment had become the foundation for everything I'd accomplished since. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't what they hand you freely, but what you build when they bet against you and you prove them wrong by refusing to quit when everything seems impossible. The morning after that life-changing meeting with Robert Chen, I woke up in my apartment with the surreal realization that I now owned the company that had shaped my entire childhood. Mitchell Construction, the business empire my father had built from nothing, was now legally and completely mine. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any structural load I'd ever calculated as an engineer. My phone had been buzzing since 6 a.m. with calls from suppliers, subcontractors, and employees who'd heard rumors about ownership changes at Mitchell Construction. Word travels fast in the construction industry, especially when it involves a company as established and visible as the one Dad had built over 4 decades. The first call I returned was to Maria Santos, my project manager at Heritage Construction, who'd become not just an employee but a trusted advisor during our company's rapid growth. "Sarah, I'm hearing some wild stories about Mitchell Construction. Is it true that you now own both companies?" "It's true," I said, still processing the magnitude of what had happened. My father's will included provisions that I didn't know about until yesterday. The inheritance Jake thought was permanent was actually conditional on performance standards that he didn't meet. Maria was quiet for a moment, probably calculating the implications for Heritage Construction and our employees. "What does this mean for us? Are we merging with Mitchell Construction, or are you planning to run them as separate companies?" It was a question I'd been wrestling with since leaving Chen's office the previous afternoon. Heritage Construction had developed its own culture, reputation, and client relationships over 3 years of careful building. Mitchell Construction, despite its recent struggles under Jake's leadership, still had valuable assets, established contracts, and employees who'd been part of Dad's vision from the beginning. "I think we're going to merge," I said, "but in a way that preserves what makes Heritage Construction special while fixing what's broken at Mitchell Construction. I want to meet with our entire team this afternoon to discuss how we're going to handle this transition." The Heritage Construction team meeting took place in our conference room, which still featured folding tables and borrowed equipment, but had become the strategic center for planning projects worth millions of dollars. Tony Ramirez, Kevin Wong, and our other core team members listened intently as I explained the inheritance situation and the opportunities it created for expanding our impact in Colorado's construction industry. "Here's what I'm thinking," I said, spreading financial statements and organizational charts across the table. "Mitchell Construction has infrastructure, equipment, and client relationships that could take us decades to develop independently. But they've lost their focus on the quality and integrity that made them successful originally." I outlined a merger plan that would combine Heritage Construction's commitment to craftsmanship with Mitchell Construction's scale and resources. The integrated company would operate under the Mitchell Construction name out of respect for Dad's legacy, but with Heritage Construction's operational standards and employee-focused culture. "Tony, you'd become head of field operations for the entire company. Kevin, you'd oversee all electrical and systems work. Maria, you'd manage project coordination across both residential and commercial divisions." I looked around the table at people who'd taken risks to join a startup and had built something exceptional through skill and dedication. "What about Jake?" Kevin asked. "Is he going to be part of this new structure, or is this a hostile takeover situation?" It was a fair question that went to the heart of how we'd handle the human aspects of combining two companies with very different recent histories. Jake is going to remain involved, but in a reduced capacity focused on business development, rather than operational management. He's acknowledged that his approach to running the company wasn't working, and he's agreed to accept my leadership. The conversation that followed revealed both excitement and concern among the Heritage Construction team. They were proud of what we'd built together and worried about losing the collaborative culture that had made our company special. But they also understood the opportunity to apply our principles on a larger scale while providing stability and better benefits for everyone involved. "Sarah," Maria said, "we trust your judgment about this merger, but we want assurance that you won't compromise the values that made Heritage Construction successful just to accommodate Mitchell Construction's existing practices." "That's exactly why I'm having this conversation with you," I replied. "The merged company is going to operate according to our standards, not theirs. Quality first, employee respect, client relationships built on trust rather than low-bid competition. If we can't maintain those principles at larger scale, then the merger isn't worth doing." That afternoon, I drove to Mitchell Construction headquarters for the first time in 3 years, carrying copies of the legal documents that had transferred, ownership, and a strategic plan for integrating both companies. The building looked exactly the same from the outside, but I knew that everything inside was about to change in fundamental ways. The conference room where Jake had delivered news of my debt inheritance was now the setting for a very different kind of meeting. Jake was already there when I arrived, along with Mitchell Construction's senior management team, including several people I'd known since childhood when they'd worked directly for Dad. "Good afternoon, everyone," I said, taking the seat at the head of the table that Jake had occupied 3 years earlier. "I know there's been a lot of speculation about ownership changes and what they might mean for Mitchell Construction's future. I'm here to provide clarity and discuss our path forward." I distributed copies of the ownership transfer documents and waited while the management team reviewed the legal language that formalized my authority over every aspect of the company's operations. The expressions around the table ranged from confusion to concern to curiosity about what changes were coming. First, I want to acknowledge that Mitchell Construction has faced challenges over the past 3 years, I began. Financial performance has declined, client relationships have been strained, and employee turnover has increased significantly. These problems didn't develop overnight, and they won't be solved overnight. I pulled out the Heritage Construction portfolio and financial statements showing the management team what our smaller company had accomplished during the same period when Mitchell Construction had been struggling. But I also want to demonstrate that the principles my father built this company on are still relevant and profitable when applied consistently. The comparison between Heritage Construction's growth trajectory and Mitchell Construction's decline was stark and undeniable. While Jake had been chasing larger contracts and higher revenues, we'd been building deeper client relationships and maintaining the kind of quality standards that generated repeat business and referrals. "Sarah," said Frank Morrison, Mitchell Construction's longtime operations manager who'd worked for Dad since the 1990s, "what are you planning to do with employees who've been here for years? Are you going to replace us with people from Heritage? Construction?" It was exactly the question I'd expected and prepared for. "Frank, you and everyone else who's committed to maintaining high standards will have opportunities to grow and contribute in the merged company. But I am going to make changes to operational procedures, quality control systems, and client relationship management." I outlined the integration plan that would combine both companies' strengths while addressing Mitchell Construction's operational weaknesses. Heritage Construction's project management systems would be implemented across all divisions. Our quality control procedures would become company-wide standards. Our employee profit-sharing and safety incentive programs would be extended to everyone. But I'm also going to implement accountability measures that weren't in place before, I continued. Project managers will be evaluated on client satisfaction as well as profit margins. Safety violations will result in immediate corrective action. Cost overruns caused by poor planning or execution will be documented and addressed. The management team asked detailed questions about timeline, authority structure, and specific operational changes. Some of their concerns reflected legitimate worries about adapting to new systems and standards. Others revealed defensive attitudes about practices that had contributed to the company's recent problems. "Jake," I said, addressing my brother directly for the first time since the meeting began, "would you like to explain your role in the new structure and your perspective on these changes?" Jake cleared his throat and looked around the table at colleagues who'd worked for him during his 3 years as company leader. "I've agreed to focus on business development and client relationships, while Sarah handles operational management and strategic planning. I think this arrangement plays to our respective strengths and addresses areas where I struggled as sole leader." His acknowledgement of past mistakes and willingness to accept reduced authority surprised several people in the room who'd expected a more confrontational dynamic between us. But it also established the tone for how we'd handle the transition period and ongoing collaboration. Over the next 2 hours, we worked through detailed implementation plans for merging personnel, combining equipment resources, and integrating client contracts. The process revealed both opportunities and challenges that would determine whether the merger created value or simply combined two companies' problems. The biggest opportunity was in project capabilities. Heritage Construction's expertise in complex residential work could be combined with Mitchell Construction's commercial experience to bid on mixed-use developments and institutional projects that neither company could handle independently. The expanded workforce would allow us to take on multiple large projects simultaneously without overextending our management capacity. The biggest challenge was cultural integration. Heritage Construction had developed a collaborative, quality-focused culture during 3 years of rapid growth. Mitchell Construction had developed a more hierarchical, efficiency-focused culture during 4 decades of steady expansion. Bridging those differences would require careful change management and clear communication about expectations. But as the meeting progressed, I realized that many Mitchell Construction employees were hungry for exactly the kind of leadership and direction that Heritage Construction had provided. 3 years of declining performance and increased stress had left people wondering whether the company Dad had built was still capable of competing successfully in Colorado's evolving construction market. "Sarah," said Jennifer Walsh, Mitchell Construction's accounting manager, "what you're describing sounds like a return to the way your father ran the company before he got sick. We used to be known for treating clients and employees better than anyone else in the industry." "That's exactly what I'm hoping to achieve," I replied. "Dad built this company on principles that created sustainable competitive advantages. We're going to recommit to those principles while adding modern project management tools and quality systems that support, rather than replace, human judgment and craftsmanship." The meeting concluded with agreement on a 90-day integration timeline that would allow both companies to complete existing projects while implementing new operational procedures. Heritage Construction's current contracts would be fulfilled under our established protocols, while Mitchell Construction's ongoing projects would be completed with enhanced quality oversight and client communication. More importantly, we'd established a framework for combining two companies' worth of talented people in service of a vision that honored Dad's legacy while addressing current market realities. The merged company would be larger and more capable than either organization had been independently, but only if we could successfully blend different approaches to construction management. That evening, I called a family meeting at Mom's house in Lakewood, the same kitchen where Dad used to spread blueprints across the table while explaining project challenges to anyone who'd listen. Mom had stayed out of the inheritance dispute, but she'd watched both her children struggle with the consequences of Dad's unconventional estate planning. "So it's finally over?" Mom asked, pouring coffee and settling into the chair where Dad used to sit when he came home from long days. "At job sites. You know what your father was trying to accomplish with all this complexity?" "I think so," I said, showing her the legal documents that had transferred Mitchell Construction ownership and the strategic plans for merging both companies. He wanted to make sure that whoever inherited the company had earned the authority to lead it effectively. Jake arrived while I was explaining the merger structure and his role in the new organization. He looked more relaxed than I'd seen him in years, as if accepting reduced responsibility had lifted weight from his shoulders rather than diminishing his status. "Mom," Jake said, "I need to tell you something about the past 3 years. I made mistakes running Mitchell Construction that damaged the reputation Dad spent his life building." Sarah proved herself capable of creating something exceptional from nothing, while I proved myself incapable of maintaining what Dad gave me. It was the most honest self-assessment I'd heard from Jake since we were teenagers, and it revealed growth and humility that Dad's test had forced him to develop. Perhaps the real purpose of the 3-year evaluation hadn't been to determine a winner and loser, but to help both of us understand our strengths and limitations well enough to work together effectively. "Your father would be proud of both of you," Mom said, looking back and forth between us. "Not because of business success or financial performance, but because you've learned to put family legacy ahead of personal pride." The conversation that followed lasted until nearly midnight, covering everything from childhood memories of Dad's construction projects to adult questions about how to honor his values while adapting to changing industry conditions. For the first time since Dad's death, Jake and I talked honestly about our different relationships with him and different understandings of what Mitchell Construction represented. "Sarah," Jake said as we prepared to leave, "I want you to know that I'm genuinely excited about working under your leadership. I've seen what Heritage Construction accomplished, and I think applying those principles to Mitchell Construction could create something Dad never imagined possible." The following Monday morning, I walked into Mitchell Construction headquarters as the official owner and CEO, carrying boxes of Heritage Construction files and a laptop loaded with project management, software that would revolutionize how the company tracked quality, safety, and client satisfaction. The first change I implemented was a company-wide meeting where every employee, from executives to laborers, would hear directly from me about our vision for the merged organization. The warehouse space where we gathered was the same area where Dad used to hold his monthly all-hands meetings, explaining upcoming projects and recognizing outstanding performance. "Good morning, everyone," I said, standing where Dad had stood hundreds of times during 4 decades of building Mitchell Construction's reputation. "For those who don't know me, I'm Sarah Mitchell, Richard's daughter, and as of last Friday, I'm the owner and CEO of this company." I explained the inheritance situation without going into detail about Jake's performance issues, focusing instead on opportunities for growth and improvement that would benefit everyone in the room. The merger with Heritage Construction would bring new projects, new capabilities, and new benefits for employees who demonstrated commitment to quality and safety. "But I'm also going to be honest about challenges we need to address," I continued. "Mitchell Construction's reputation has suffered over the past 3 years due to quality problems, safety violations, and client relationship issues. We're going to fix those problems by returning to the principles my father built this company on." I outlined specific changes that would take effect immediately: enhanced safety training and incentives, quality bonuses tied to client satisfaction scores, profit-sharing programs that aligned everyone's interests with long-term success rather than short-term cost-cutting. "Most importantly," I said, "we're going to treat every project like we're building a home for our own family. That standard isn't just idealistic rhetoric. It's a practical business strategy that creates repeat clients, referrals, and the kind of reputation that allows us to charge premium prices for premium work." The response from longtime Mitchell Construction employees was overwhelmingly positive. Many of them remembered working under Dad's leadership and had been frustrated by changes that prioritized speed over quality during Jake's tenure. They were ready for leadership that understood construction as both a technical challenge and a human endeavor. Over the following weeks, I divided my time between completing Heritage Construction's existing projects and implementing operational changes. At Mitchell Construction, the integration was complex and occasionally difficult, but it was also energizing in ways I hadn't anticipated. Watching Heritage Construction's quality standards take root in Mitchell Construction's larger workforce was like seeing Dad's original vision for the company implemented with modern tools and systems. Project managers who'd been pressured to cut corners were relieved to have support for doing things the right way. Craftsmen who'd been treated as interchangeable labor were excited about profit sharing and skill development opportunities. The real test came 6 months after the merger, when we completed our first major project under the new operational structure. The development was a mixed-use building in downtown Denver that combined residential condominiums with ground-floor retail space, requiring coordination between multiple architectural firms, engineering consultants, and specialty contractors. The project had been contracted under Jake's leadership with aggressive scheduling and tight profit margins that left little room for error or quality enhancement. Under Heritage Construction's operational approach, we'd managed to deliver the building ahead of schedule while exceeding quality specifications and maintaining safety standards that earned recognition from state regulators. More importantly, the client was so impressed with our performance that they immediately contracted us for 2 additional developments worth $12 million in combined construction value. The repeat business validated our approach and demonstrated that premium quality work generated premium prices and ongoing relationships. But the measure of success that would have meant most to Dad wasn't financial performance or industry recognition. It was the satisfaction of walking through completed projects with families who were moving into homes we'd built, knowing that our work would shelter and protect them for generations to come. Standing in the penthouse condominium of that downtown development, looking out at the Denver skyline that included dozens of buildings bearing Dad's craftsmanship legacy, I understood what he'd been trying to teach both Jake and me through his elaborate inheritance test. True leadership isn't about inheriting authority or commanding respect through position. It's about earning trust through demonstrated competence, creating value for everyone who depends on your decisions, and building something that will outlast your own involvement in it. The debt that had seemed like punishment 4 years earlier had become the foundation for everything I'd accomplished since. It had forced me to develop financial discipline, resourcefulness, and determination that I'd never needed as a salaried engineer. Building Heritage Construction from nothing had taught me lessons about leadership, risk management, and client relationships that I couldn't have learned any other way. Jake's inheritance had given him immediate access to Mitchell Construction's established systems and client base, but it hadn't prepared him for the leadership challenges that come with adapting to changing market conditions while maintaining quality standards. His struggles had taught him humility and self-awareness that success alone never could have provided. Together, we'd created something stronger than either company could have been independently. Mitchell Construction was now positioned for sustainable growth based on the principles Dad had established, enhanced by modern project management tools and expanded capabilities that served clients better than any competitor in Colorado. The YAF company employed over 200 people whose families depended on our continued success. Our decisions influenced not just financial performance, but the livelihoods of everyone who'd chosen to build their careers around Dad's vision for what construction could be when approached with integrity and craftsmanship. 6 months later, I received a call that would have made Dad prouder than any financial milestone or industry award. The Colorado Associated General Contractors had selected Mitchell Construction as their member company of the year, recognizing our commitment to safety, quality, and employee development during a period of significant organizational change. But the real validation came in smaller, more personal moments. When Tony Ramirez brought his teenage son to job sites and explained construction techniques with the same patience Dad had shown me 30 years earlier. When Maria Santos was promoted to Vice President of Operations and became the first woman to hold executive leadership at Mitchell Construction. When Jake successfully negotiated a partnership with a sustainable building consultant that positioned us as leaders in environmentally responsible construction. The legacy Dad had built wasn't just a company or a collection of completed projects. It was an approach to work that valued people as much as profits, quality as much as efficiency, and long-term relationships as much as short-term gains. That legacy lived on not because we'd inherited it, but because we'd earned the right to carry it forward through our own efforts and choices. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't what someone gives you freely, but what you build when they challenge you to prove yourself worthy of what they've created. Dad's unconventional estate planning had forced both Jake and me to discover capabilities we didn't know we possessed, and to develop character that success alone couldn't have taught us. The debt that had seemed like betrayal had become blessing. The test that had felt like punishment had become opportunity. The family business that had divided us through competition had united us through collaboration based on mutual respect rather than inherited hierarchy. Standing in that same conference room where this journey had begun 4 years earlier, now filled with architectural drawings for projects that would employ our crews for the next 2 years, I understood that Dad's greatest gift hadn't been the company itself, but the chance to discover who I could become when challenged to exceed my own expectations of what was possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.